Today we are reviewing from Amazon Prime the 1985 film The Explorers, directed by Joe Dante, who was famous for directing quite a few movies aimed at children in that particular era of filmmaking. The film stars Ethan Hawke, a very young River Phoenix, rest in peace, and a guy by the name of Jason Presson, who did not go on to continue starring in movies in his later years. This wasn't his final acting job, but he, as an adult, is not still an actor. The film is set in 1980s Washington, D.C. for the most part, and the characters are Ben, who is Ethan Hawke's character, who is a teenage boy with dreams of becoming an astronaut. River Phoenix's character is Wolfgang, who's the son of scientists, who is himself a scientist. He even has his own lab where he runs experiments with the approval of his parents. And Darren, a young kid from an unhappy home, who in the early part of the film makes friends with the other two boys and jumps onto their dreams of space exploration. Okay, so Act 1, after a series of bizarre dreams which reveal the plans to build this spaceship, the kids begin building essentially a homemade spaceship. Originally, they're just building a device and they don't know what it does. And that's pretty much the entire Act 1. This is not the fastest paced film, despite the fact that it's aimed at kids. It is aimed at kids of a different era, and we'll get to that. Act 2 is largely concerned with testing the spaceship and figuring out how it works, how it flies, how they're going to breathe in it, and things like that. And it's fairly entertaining. I was entertained watching it, but I'm a kid from the era that this film was aimed at, which is a little different than today. Then you get to Act 3. Act 3 of the film, which is, I remember when this film came out, is largely how the film is advertised. And even if you go on Amazon and you look at the thumbnail for this movie, the thumbnail for this movie gives you a picture that takes place in Act 3. And my goodness, if you go into this film expecting the whole film to be what Act 3 is, you will be really confused and a little bit let down. All I will say is Act 3 goes in hard for very silly, bizarre comedy that is aimed at younger children. In fact, I would honestly say that Act 3 is aimed at much younger children than Act 1 and 2. It's almost like Act 1 and 2 are designed to entertain kids in their very, very early teens. What we today call tweens. That wasn't a word when I was a child, but yes, it's aimed at like 13-year-olds, and mostly 13-year-old boys. And Act 3 is like it's meant to entertain 6 and 7-year-olds. It's really, really silly physical comedy, and it's like a Muppet Show, and that's all I'll say about that without giving things away. Although a lot of what I would be talking about is given away in that thumbnail I'm talking about. The upside of the movie is all of these actors are young. There's a reason why Ethan Hawke is still an actor today. There's a reason why we still talk about River Phoenix. And it's pretty clear that talent ran in his family when you look at his younger brother, who's an Oscar winner today. It is an interesting film. And if you, like me, were a boy roughly the age of the kids in this film who had an interest in space travel and science fiction in general, this movie holds the interest of kids like that from that era. The most obvious downside is a silly ending that doesn't fit the rest of the film at all. It is completely out of place. There is nothing in the Act 1 and Act 2 that is anywhere near as silly as what's in Act 3. The second downside is the late payoff. The fact that Act 1 and Act 2 are relatively grounded and you don't get to the more sci-fi parts of the story until Act 3, it will be very off-putting to a lot of children. This was a technique that was very often used in films prior to the modern era, the current era of filmmaking, in which a lot of stories banked on putting the thing that brought you to the theater in Act 3. A lot of monster films didn't show the monster till Act 3. A lot of action movies had very little action until Act 3. Back in those times, there was a long history of what we would call bottom-heavy movies. And this is one of those. And even in that time, I thought that that was the wrong way to make movies. I always hated monster movies where the monster doesn't show up till the third act, or action movies where all of the good action is in the third act and the first two acts were a little bit boring or whatever. Suspense movies that suddenly turn into action movies at the end. That's kind of what they used to make, and that's kind of the same facet, the strategy that they're using here. And obviously, that is a result of the third thing that is a downside of this movie, and that's the pacing. There is something that I've always called, some people call it American attention deficit disorder. It's really internet attention deficit disorder at this point. People are very much used to near instant gratification. If you want to see an action scene, you can just look you can look up any action scene you want on the internet and someone's posted it somewhere. And back in the day, people were much more patient about things like that because there was no other place to see these things. There was no internet. There was no way to just get an action scene on screen if you wanted one. If you wanted to see an action scene, you had to watch an entire movie. If you wanted to see a special effects scene, you had to watch an entire movie. And films took advantage of that, and they had much slower pacing and much later payoffs than what we're used to in today's modern films. In the end, this is given modern standards because we're watching this film today. We're not watching it in 1985 when it was made. This is a 3-star movie. It's entertaining. I found it entertaining. I'm not entirely sure that a child of the modern era would find this film as entertaining as I do. It might be 2 to 2.5 stars for a kid. If you know a kid who's really into things like science fiction and spaceships and stuff like that, he might give it 3 stars like I do. But it's a 3-star movie. For me, I'm reviewing it as the person I am now. It's a 3-star movie. It is The Explorers, and you can watch it today if you've got Amazon Prime. Thanks for watching. I'm Ed Bo. If you like this video, you might want to consider hitting the like button. It helps me out. It helps me out if you hit the like button on YouTube. It doesn't do anything for my YouTube algorithm if you hit like on Facebook. Those are 2 separate things. YouTube does not pay attention to Facebook numbers. And you might want to consider subscribing to my channel. That also helps. And if you know anyone who's into films and is really, really bored during the quarantine era of America, share this video with them. They might get a kick out of it. They might get a kick out of the movies I'm reviewing. And I will see you in the next episode. Thanks for watching.